The October Revolution of 1917 in Russia was the greatest single event in the whole of history. Now, why do I say this? Well, for the first time here, if one excludes the glorious but tragically defeated episode, which was the Paris Commune, for the first time, the masses, that's to say, the millions of ordinary men and women, overthrew the old monstrous regime of oppression of Tsarism, which has lasted hundreds of years, and at least began the historic task of the transformation of society. Now, the fact that that enormous adventure, if you like, did not ultimately end in success was not due to any mistake on the part of the Bolsheviks of Lenin or Trotsky or anything like that, but due entirely to objective circumstances, which is not the subject of the present discussion. But the isolation of the Russian Revolution and the conditions of terrible backwardness eventually led to the distortion of the revolution with the rise of a privileged bureaucratic caste. Ultimately, it was led by the leader of what was in effect a political counter-revolution in Russia. That's the person that's known to us as Stalin. Now, after Lenin's death, Leon Trotsky, who let's not forget this, the man who together with Lenin led the Russian Revolution, led the October Revolution, conducted a courageous struggle against the Stalinist degeneration of the Russian Revolution. But he could not succeed because of the objective conditions was against him. I can't go into this in this discussion. And therefore, what you had in Russia was a terrible caricature, if you like, a bureaucratic and totalitarian caricature of the October Revolution under Stalin. And the only way that this new caste, that's what we have to describe them as, a caste of bureaucratic usurpers, okay? The only way they could consolidate their power was by the total and complete elimination of all of the great democratic traditions of the Russian Revolution. The memory of October had to be completely eliminated. And that's the reason why the Stalinist bureaucracy, in order to take power, had to physically eliminate, liquidate, exterminate all of the old Bolshevik party, all of Lenin's party, all of Lenin's Central Committee. All the leaders of the Russian Revolution were murdered by Stalin in the notorious purge trials, the Moscow trials, which Trotsky described. This is from the 1930s onwards. 1936 they began and culminated, in about 1938. But the purge trials, the monstrous Moscow trials, were described adequately by Trotsky as a unilateral, a one-sided civil war against Bolshevism, against Lenin's party. And that's a fact. One by one, all the main leaders of the revolution, the leaders of the Bolshevik party, Lenin's colleagues and companions and comrades, were liquidated in the most monstrous manner. Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, Radek, Rakovsky, all of them, one by one were first of all put up before what amounted to a kangaroo court, where they were accused of all kinds of monstrous things. Men who dedicated their lives to the revolution, to the Bolshevik party, were leaders of the Russian Revolution, were actually accused of plotting against the Russian Revolution and even plotting to assassinate Lenin, if you can imagine any such a thing. And yet these men, courageous revolutionaries, eventually, one by one, in front of this monstrous court, actually confessed to the commission of these crimes, confessed to being agents of Hitler, agents of fascism, plotting to overthrow the Soviet Union, plotting to restore capitalism, if you please. Now, you can ask yourself the question, how is it possible, how is it conceivable that men like, for example, Rakovsky, the best example, a very courageous revolutionary, could possibly confess to such a crime, to cover himself with filth in public. Now, actually, the question sounds a difficult one to answer. It's not really very difficult at all. You see, we human beings are weak people. We're weak individuals, weak animals. And there's only so much pressure and torture that the body can stand. Even the most courageous individual eventually will break under pressure, under torture. And this regime, this terrible regime, the most monstrous, murderous regime in history. Okay. Comparable to this, the only comparison I can think of would be the Spanish Inquisition. It had all kinds of fiendish methods of torture, beatings, and all kinds of physical and mental torture, including torture and attacks and threats towards their families, because Stalin's thirst for revenge did not stop with just killing, murdering the men who were his political opponents. Although actually, by that time, none of them really presented any threat. They were broken men by this time. But nevertheless, they had to be removed. And they had to be removed because Stalin, by the way, the greatest criminal in the whole of history. I mean, compared to the crimes of Stalin, the crimes of other criminals in the past can't be compared. He was the greatest criminal in history, and like all criminals, he had to eliminate all witnesses. He could not leave any trace, any witness of his own crimes and the crimes of the caste, of usurpers which he represented. I tell you, all these people had to be liquidated. Not only that, Stalin was a monster whose thirst for revenge extended even to the families and the relatives and the neighbours, and the friends and the comrades of the accused. The whole families ended up in the Gulag, as it was known, in the concentration camps. These hellish camps where prisoners were beaten and starved to death and worked to death, places like Vorkuta, where nevertheless, by the way, it must be stated here, the Trotskyists in Vorkuta, for example, maintained their organization despite all these terrible conditions. Even in these hellholes, maintained their organization, maintained their ideas, maintained their loyalty to the international revolution and so on, and went to their deaths, went out into the frozen tundra where they were shot in groups of 10 people shot, killed in these icy wildernesses. They went to their death singing the Internationale and proclaiming their loyalty to the Russian Revolution, to the October Revolution, to Lenin and to Trotsky. Because here you see, here's the point, here's the great weakness of the Moscow trials. The main witness at the Moscow trials was absent. The man who was accused by Stalin of being behind all of these alleged crimes, of being an agent of the Gestapo, agent of Hitler, and so on and so forth, was absent. That man was Leon Trotsky. Trotsky had been expelled from the party in 1928, I think it was, or 29, and was expelled from the Soviet Union at a time when Stalin didn't feel confident enough to have him murdered. It was too early for that. Trotsky was too well known, too popular, if you like. And therefore he was exiled, which probably undoubtedly saved his life. And that he was in exile. But even in exile, you see, Stalin still regarded him with great fear as an enormous, a dangerous enemy, and somebody that had to be eliminated. Now, Trotsky in exile, you see, it's difficult for us now to imagine the horrendous problems that Trotsky faced. Here he was, isolated, on his own, in Turkey, first of all, and then other countries, he asked one country after another for admission, to be admitted as an exile, as somebody that required asylum, an asylum seeker, which according to international law, he should have been accepted. Why not? Other people, even Karl Marx, don't forget, was an exile, a political exile in London for many years. But one so-called democratic country, after they closed their doors against Trotsky, nobody would admit him. you had some kind of a debilitance in France, which has turned out to be counterproductive, and then Norway, which turned out to be even more counterproductive. But nowhere could he find exit. He could try the United States repeatedly. And Roosevelt, who was supposed to be a Democrat, supposed to be a liberal, refused to allow him to set foot in the United States. Finally, there was a phrase, by the way, I think it was by André Breton, the famous French writer, who described this situation, this monstrous situation, as the planet without a visa. Planet without a visa. One man against the entire world. Just think about it. One man against the most monstrous, the most powerful murder machine in the whole of history. It was in the hands of Stalin. And Stalin was bent on the destruction of this one man, who he insisted be named in all these monstrous trials which took place one after the other as the main architect of the so-called conspiracy, non-existent conspiracy, of a non-existent reactionary counter-revolutionary opposition inside Russia. Trotsky finally was admitted. The only country in the world that was prepared to grant him asylum was Mexico, which at that time was under the lead of a progressive man, a general. He was an army general, Lázaro Cárdenas, who nevertheless was left-wing. He was progressive. He nationalized the oil industry in Mexico and conducted other reforms. And he insisted on allowing Trotsky to be admitted into Mexico, which actually was then done. And from Mexico, just imagine the problem. One man, as I repeat, one man against the entire world, without all the resources which Stalin possessed. Stalin, don't forget, had in his possession, had complete control on all of the power, the resources, the wealth, the machinery of repression and so on of the Soviet Union. All this power was directed against one man, on his own practically, in Mexico, with a small band of supporters. And yet Trotsky, even from exile, continued to shout his defiance, shout his opposition to Stalin, and above all, he devoted a lot of his time into denouncing the fraudulent nature of the so-called Moscow trials, the show trials. His son actually started, even when Trotsky was virtually kidnapped under house arrest, in effect, in Norway, and he was gagged, not allowed to express any opinion or publish any articles. His son, León in Paris, published a little book, a pamphlet called The Red Book of the Moscow Trials, where he began the task, the painstaking task of exposing the lies. It was full of lies, a tissue of lies from start to finish, which any self-respecting lawyer in any democratic court of justice would have demolished in 5 minutes. And so Sedov began this task. He couldn't complete it. He himself was then murdered, of course, naturally by Stalin. Stalin had him killed, assassinated, in a hospital in Switzerland. And therefore Trotsky was left practically alone to carry on this struggle. And he hit upon an idea, although he was in a very weak position, it has to be said. He hit upon the idea in 1937 of launching a commission of investigation into the Moscow trials, which became the reason it was called the Dewey Commission is that the chairman, president of this commission, was an famous American philosopher, actually, by the name of John Dewey, a well-known philosopher at that time. Not a Marxist, not even a particularly left-wing, but he was quite a progressive man in his own way. He certainly his views had nothing in common with Marxism or Trotskyism. And yet, Trotsky deliberately chose John Dewey precisely for that reason, that nobody could point a finger and say that this is a ringed commission, this is composed of Trotskyists, this is all one-sided and therefore fraudulent. Trotsky put together a commission he thought composed of honest people, of labor leaders, trade union leaders, prominent intellectuals. people that could be relied on, judicial figures, people that could be relied upon to give a balanced, a reasonable, a rational account of themselves. However, even in this commission, Stalin and the GPU succeeded in infiltrating one of their agents, an American by the name of Carlton Beals, about whom we will speak a little bit later, who did his best to sabotage the workings of the Dewey Commission from the inside. Now, I will not go into the workings of this commission. I think I dealt with this on previous occasions, so I won't repeat what I said then. But this commission spent months and months assembling a mass of evidence. They repeatedly questioned Trotsky about his role in the revolution, about his attitude towards Stalin, about the regime and so on. Trotsky answered in a masterful manner. You will find Trotsky's statements to the Dewey Commission in a marvelous book. I mean, if the Commission had no other justification, this would be sufficient justification for what it did, called The Case of Leon Trotsky. If you've not read this book, I recommend you. It's a big, thick book. It's true. But this volume contains a systematic account of the history of Bolshevism, what the Bolshevik Party stood for, what Lenin and Trotsky stood for, what Stalin represented, and so on. It's a marvelous book. And finally, at the end, they produced another book called Not Guilty, which sums up the conclusions, which clearly proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, to any reasonable person, any thinking person, that the Moscow trials were indeed a terrible farce and a complete travesty, breaking all the laws, not just of socialism and Bolshevism, but all the laws of any democratic or properly run judicial or legal system. It was, in that sense, a tremendous success. Although, as I say, this man, Carlton Beals, did his best following Stalin's instructions to sabotage and to smear and to divert attention and so on. And finally, he walked out of the commission, denouncing it as a fraud. He went public and so on. This was also subsequently answered by Trotsky and by the members of the Dewey Commission. And Carlton Beals was exposed. So here you have the sum total of the Dewey Commission, as has become known. Was this a successful thing? Did it have a tremendous angle? Well, bear in mind that at that time Trotsky was in a weak position. He had a certain amount of support in the United States. Supporters actually had a big meeting of his supporters. Where he wasn't allowed to go to speak at the meeting. Roosevelt again refused him permission. A telephone conversation was arranged, and he made this splendid speech, which you can read in a pamphlet form. It was published in Britain by our supporters, but the Workers' International League at that time, led by Ted Grant. And the speech is called I Stake My Life, in which he actually said, look, I'm prepared to go before this impartial committee, this commission, and present my case. If, by any chance, I'm found guilty of this on the slightest count, on any of the counts of which I'm accused, I will volunteer to hand myself over the next day to the Stalinists, to Moscow, to stand trial in Moscow. That was the offer that he made in this marvelous speech, I Stake My Life. There's some doubt about what happened to that, but I won't go into that because I don't really know, except to say that it wasn't really satisfactory. It wasn't satisfactory. Broadcast wasn't satisfactory. It might have been for technical reasons, that's possible. Or there might have been an element of sabotage. The Stalinists would be perfectly capable of doing such a thing. I don't know. Beside the point. The point that I'm making is that, of course, the audience which Trotsky was able to reach at that time was quite limited compared to the huge resources of Stalin and the GPU, which of course controlled not just newspapers and broadcasting services, and all of these things, and politicians, but also a large part of the left were pro-Stalinist, pro-Moscow. Trade union leaders like Toledano in Mexico is a case in point, were Stalinists. And therefore, Trotsky's little voice, therefore, was in a sense like whispering against thunder. Therefore, if I'm asked honestly, what was the actual effect of the commission? Well, it did have an effect, of course, undoubtedly. Here, it was the only time, then or since, when there was a systematic attempt to expose the lies and the fraudulent nature of the Moscow trials. That certainly had an effect on a number of thinking people, intellectuals and other people, particularly in Britain. That was the case. It had an effect. But the effect was limited. I would say that the real effect, the real historical justification for the Dewey Commission was not so much in its immediate effect on what you might call public opinion, but it was on the tremendous achievement of publishing these two wonderful volumes, which I've already mentioned to you. That is the case of Leon Trotsky, and the second volume, the following volume, Not Guilty. And I would strongly urge all of you to read these books and draw your own conclusions. They really are masterpieces, I would say, of Marxist analysis, of Marxist literature. Of course, history didn't finish with the Dewey Commission, far from it. Stalin must have been concerned. He was concerned about the Dewey Commission. He was also concerned about something else, that Trotsky was writing a biography of Stalin. He was concerned about that. He wanted at all costs to silence Trotsky, which eventually, of course, he did, after a failed attempt. I think it was in May 1914. There was another attempt carried out by this agent, Jackson, or Mercader was his real name, I believe, Catalan, Stalinist, who turned up at Trotsky's house, and Trotsky admitted in. And he was supposed to be discussing an article that this man should have written, was supposed to have written. And the assassin stood behind him, pulled out this ice pick, which is concealed on this person, and struck Trotsky on the head, shattering his brain. Trotsky didn't die immediately, but the way he conducted a heroic resistance to the end. The guards rushed in. Why on earth Trotsky was left on his own with this assassin is something I can never understand, but I don't want to go into that question right now. But Trotsky, anyway, this great man, this great mind, this great brain, was forever shattered by the ice pick, by this treacherous blow, cowardly blow, of a defenseless man by this Stalinist agent on the 20th of October 1940. But you see, history didn't end there. The story doesn't end there. Far from it. Stalin, when he found out that eventually Trotsky had been assassinated, he must have been very pleased. He must have got out his bottle of champagne or vodka, more like, and celebrated with his clique. Have largely succeeded. Yeah, succeeded in what? Well, we human beings, I said earlier on, we are very weak animals. We are, compared to any other animal in nature. We don't have big, powerful bodies. We don't have powerful claws and big, powerful teeth and so on. We can't run fast. We're rather pathetic creatures, if you like, And above all, anything can destroy a human being. There's no art in that. That's not difficult. It isn't difficult to physically liquidate a human being. Anything can do that. A bullet, a bomb, a knife, an ice pick, anything. Poison, anything. You can easily destroy a human being physically. What you can never do, and that's what Stalin and the other gangsters did not and could not understand, you cannot destroy an idea whose time has come. That's a fact. And the ideas represented by Leon Trotsky, which, by the way, let's be clear about this, are the same identical ideas defended by Lenin and the Bolshevik Party. Trotsky always described himself and his followers as Bolshevik Leninists. We are the continuation of Lenin's real heritage of Bolshevism, Leninism, not this horrible, atrocious, bureaucratic and totalitarian caricature of Stalinism, which collapsed in the end. It was bound to collapse. Trotsky predicted that. Of course, that's the case. And by the way, I must say here that an important part of that, of maintaining these ideas alive, that was the main thing. That's the main thing that Trotsky dedicated himself to. That's what people don't understand. Isaac Deutscher wrote this biography, which personally I do not like. I don't approve of it. Other people do that. That's their business. But Deutscher, I consider to be a Philistine writer, actually said he praises Trotsky in the early days as a revolutionary, as the leader, the founder of the Red Army, and so on and so forth, the Civil War and so on. But then he says, well, Trotsky, the last 10 years of Trotsky's life was like a desert. He says it achieved nothing. To write these lines, that really shows the mentality of a miserable Philistine, which Deutscher, I think, very, very good writer, of course, but nevertheless, he was a complete Philistine. Nothing to do with the ideas of Trotsky. Understood nothing. And it was Trotsky himself, in his diary in exile, who wrote, I've not got the book with me, but you can check it for yourselves, who wrote the following. He said, look, if I consider the whole of my life, there have been many times in which you can say that I played an important role. For example, the Russian Revolution itself, or the Civil War, yes, all that is true. However, if I had not been president in 1917, probably Lenin would have overcome the resistance of people like Stalin, by the way, and Zinoviev, and the revolution would have never succeeded. That's quite likely. Also, the Civil War, without the presence of Leon Trotsky. However, Trotsky said, the one period in my life where I consider my presence to be absolutely indispensable has been precisely now, the last 10 years of his life, because he was the only one. Oh, yes, I can say this without fear of contradiction. Trotsky was the only one that maintained the genuine ideas of Lenin alive, maintained this flame, which would have been entirely extinguished. The Stalinists largely succeeded in doing that in the Soviet Union to an enormous degree, which I didn't anticipate they succeeded in to a large extent, not entirely. But Trotsky was the one man who maintained the real essence of Bolshevism right to the very end of his life. And after his death also, I can say that the tendency represented by Ted Grant and others, we've also maintained those ideas. And a very important role was played here in Mexico by Trotsky's grandson. Unfortunately, no longer with us. My dear friend, a very, very dear friend who I miss every day, a marvelous man, Esteban Volkov, Sieva, as he was known in Russian, Trotsky's grandson, who was the last witness, if you like, living witness of these events, when he was 14 years of age when Trotsky was murdered. Dedicated the whole of his life. I know this to be a fact. Stefan Volkov dedicated the entirety of his life only for one thing, for the maintenance of the memory of Leon Trotsky and the ideas of Leon Trotsky. What he called defense of the historical truth. And above all, he did this in a material way by creating and developing the Leon Trotsky Museum, which still exists now. Unfortunately, he passed away not too long ago. He's no longer with us. But his memory and his condition now is maintained by my dear friend and colleague and comrade, Gabriela Perez Noriega, the present director of the Casa Museo Leon Trotsky, who's done marvelous work, really tremendous work, in developing and maintaining and defending that museum against all the tremendous pressures which have been exerted. And that's something which deserves to be supported to this very day. The Casa Museo Leon Trotsky remains as an important landmark, an important standard, an important point of reference, if you like, for those people throughout the world who still wish to defend the genuine ideas of the greatest event in human history, which was the Russian Revolution of October 1917.